It was a regular afternoon when Maria, a bright and cheerful 14-year-old girl, was walking home from school. The sun was shining, and she hummed a tune as she skipped along the sidewalk. She was wearing her favorite purple hoodie, and her long curly hair bounced with each step. The world seemed to be at peace, and everything felt right. But that peace was about to be shattered. As Maria walked through a quiet neighborhood, a police car pulled up beside her. She barely noticed at first, continuing her walk, thinking it was just another routine patrol. However, the car stopped, and a tall, uniformed officer stepped out. His expression was stern, and his eyes seemed to lock onto her with an intensity that made Maria pause. "Hey, you," the officer called, his voice cutting through the air. Maria turned, a little confused. "Yes, sir," she asked politely, unsure of why she was being stopped. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You've been acting suspicious, walking around like that. I think I should search you." He didn't ask. He simply demanded it. Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She hadn't done anything wrong, but there was something about the officer's tone that made her uncomfortable. She had heard stories about how some people used their power in ways that weren't fair, but she had never thought it would happen to her. "I don't think I did anything wrong, officer," Maria said, trying to stay calm. "I'm just walking home from school." The officer didn't listen. Without warning, he grabbed her by the arm, pulling her closer. "I'm not asking," he said, his voice colder now. Maria felt a wave of fear wash over her. She struggled to free herself, but the officer's grip was strong, much stronger than she had expected. "Stop it," Maria cried out, feeling trapped. "Let go of me." The officer didn't let go. Instead, he motioned to the back of his car, as if he planned to force her into it. Maria's heart raced. What was happening? Why was he doing this? She didn't know what to do, but she wasn't going to give in without a fight. Just then, something even more shocking happened. The officer grabbed her by the hair. Maria's eyes widened in horror as she felt him yank at her curls. The officer's hand was rough, and he pulled harder than she thought was possible. "You think you can just walk around like that?" The officer sneered as he grabbed clippers from his belt. Before Maria could react, he pressed them to her scalp. "No," Maria screamed, trying to pull away. She felt helpless as he shaved her head, taking away her beautiful curly hair without a second thought. She had always loved her hair, and now it was being taken from her in an instant. The sound of the clippers seemed to echo in her ears as she stood there, feeling the weight of the situation. Maria stood frozen, humiliated and shocked, as the officer finished shaving her head. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Was this really happening to her? Her world, just moments ago filled with light, now seemed dark and unfair. The officer looked at her, his expression cold and unbothered. He walked away, leaving Maria standing alone on the sidewalk. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She wouldn't cry in front of him. Not now. Not like this. As she stood there, feeling the cool air against her bare scalp, Maria knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Whoever this officer was, he had made a huge mistake, and Maria was going to make sure that the world knew what had happened to her. Maria stood there for a long time, feeling the breeze on her freshly shaved scalp. The tears that had threatened to fall were now hidden behind her wide eyes, filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Her hair, the one thing she'd always loved and taken care of, was gone. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and humiliated. She had never felt so small in her life. The officer walked away without saying a word, leaving her standing there on the sidewalk. Maria didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, to escape, but where would she go? How could she go home like this? She had no choice but to take a deep breath and walk forward, step by step. Maria had always been a strong girl. She had a close-knit family, a group of friends who cared about her, and her mother who always told her that beauty came from within. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All she could think about was the feeling of powerlessness, the way the officer had treated her without reason, and how her own body had been disrespected. As she walked, people stared. Some of them whispered behind their hands, others simply looked at her with pity. Maria tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. The whispers were loud, even though no one was speaking to her directly. She felt like she was being judged by everyone around her. Her heart sank deeper with each step, the weight of it growing heavier by the second. When she finally reached her street, her thoughts were all over the place. She couldn't understand why the officer had done this. What had she done to deserve such treatment? Her mind raced with confusion, but there was also anger, a quiet but fierce anger that grew stronger with each passing minute. Maria reached her front door and took a deep breath before walking inside. Her mother, Clara, was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up when the door opened and her smile faded the moment she saw her daughter's bald head. Maria. Clara's voice trembled, and Maria could see the concern in her eyes. Before Maria could say a word, her mother rushed over to her, pulling her into a tight hug. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Clara asked, her voice full of disbelief. The warmth of her mother's embrace only made Maria feel the pain more. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder, letting the tears she had held back for so long finally fall. Clara held her tighter, rocking her gently. She didn't need Maria to explain. She could see the shock and hurt on her daughter's face. She could feel it too. Maria took a few moments to calm down, wiping her tears away. "It was a cop, Mom. He shaved my hair. He just did it without asking, without any reason." Clara's face hardened with anger. She had heard about police mistreating people, but she never imagined something like this could happen to her daughter. She stepped back, looking at Maria closely. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. This wasn't your fault." Maria nodded, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. Something deep inside her told her that the officer's actions weren't just random. They meant something more. But what? Clara quickly made some calls, first to the school to find out if they had any information, then to a lawyer she trusted. She was determined to make sure this wouldn't go unpunished. No one, especially her daughter, should have to go through something like this. That night, Maria sat in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized herself. Her head was bare, and she couldn't stop the sadness from welling up inside her again. She thought of all the girls at school who would see her tomorrow, all the people who would comment. Would they pity her, laugh at her, or would they understand the injustice of it all? One thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this be the end of her story. No matter how painful it was, she would find a way to make it right. The next morning, Maria couldn't bring herself to go to school. Her mother, Clara, had been making phone calls all night. She was angry, determined, and worried about what would happen next. But Maria felt so different, so exposed, that she wasn't ready to face anyone. Clara, however, had other plans. She sat down with Maria and gently explained that the best way to deal with the situation was to speak up and show everyone just how strong Maria really was. Maria was hesitant, but she agreed to do what her mother asked. Clara assured her that they would handle things together, just as they always did. Before heading to the school, Clara decided it was time to tell Maria more about their family history, about the people who had paved the way for them, and the strength that ran through their blood. She needed to understand why what happened to her wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger picture. Maria's grandfather, Samuel, had been one of the most respected figures in their community. He had grown up in a time when it was difficult for black families to find a place in the world. But he had worked hard to build a legacy for his children and grandchildren. Samuel had opened businesses, supported other families in the neighborhood, and worked tirelessly for the betterment of their community. Maria's father, Greg, had inherited that same determination. He had grown up with a deep sense of pride in who he was and where he came from. Greg had worked his way up from humble beginnings. He wasn't just successful in business, but he had also become an important voice in local politics. He was known for his generosity, leadership, and passion for helping others. Maria had always admired her father for everything he had accomplished. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a role model for so many people. He used his wealth and influence to support causes that mattered, especially for marginalized communities. It was through his efforts that many people were able to find jobs, get access to better education, and feel heard. Clara explained that even though Greg was often in the public eye, he preferred to stay out of the spotlight when it came to his family. He didn't want his children to feel pressured by his name or his reputation. He wanted them to make their own choices and live life on their own terms. But now, Maria was learning something new about her father. Clara told her that Greg had made sure that his children, including Maria, understood the value of standing up for what was right. He had always taught them that the world would sometimes try to bring them down, but they had the power to rise above it. Maria had grown up hearing these lessons, but she never expected she'd have to live them so soon. As Clara spoke, Maria began to feel a sense of pride in her father that she had never fully understood before. Her father wasn't just a businessman. He was a protector, a leader, and someone who stood up for justice. And now, Maria realized that the officer who had humiliated her wasn't just picking on any random girl. He had unknowingly chosen to cross the line with the wrong family. Clara gave Maria a reassuring smile. "You come from a long line of strong people, baby. And now, you have to be strong too." Maria took a deep breath. For the first time since the incident, she felt something other than sadness. There was a spark of anger inside her, yes, but it was mixed with a sense of purpose. She wasn't just going to let this moment define her. She was going to use it to fight back, to stand tall like her father and grandfather had. Today was going to be the start of something different. Today, she would begin to make things right. Officer Williams had no idea the storm that was about to hit him. The morning after the incident, he went about his usual routine, feeling proud of himself for putting an end to what he considered a disorderly girl on the street. He hadn't given it a second thought. After all, in his mind, Maria was just another teenager causing trouble. To him, the action of shaving her head didn't seem like a big deal. It was simply a way to teach her a lesson. As Officer Williams went about his day, he received several calls, but none of them made him stop and reconsider his actions. He wasn't worried. Why would he be? He was just doing his job, right? But the calls, the whispers, and the news reports were starting to build up. In the hours following the incident, news about the officer's actions spread quickly across the city. People who had seen what happened spoke out. Maria's classmates and teachers began asking questions. By lunchtime, social media was buzzing with stories about the girl who had been publicly humiliated for no reason. Soon, her story went viral, and the outrage was everywhere. Despite the growing attention, Officer Williams remained confident. He figured the buzz would die down soon enough. He had done his job, and he thought it was all over. His bosses didn't seem to be reacting too strongly, so he assumed it wasn't a big deal. After all, what could go wrong? He wasn't afraid of a few angry voices. However, things were not so simple. Maria's mother, Clara, had not let the matter go. She had made calls to several important people, her lawyer, local leaders, and even some of the city's officials. She wanted justice for her daughter. She wasn't just going to let this slide. She had seen firsthand how people in power could sometimes turn a blind eye to injustice, and she wasn't about to let her daughter be another case forgotten in the system. By the time Officer Williams arrived at his shift the next day, he felt the tension in the air. He hadn't heard anything official, but something felt off. The usual friendly nods from his colleagues seemed colder now. The quiet whispers that followed him through the halls of the station made him uneasy. His sergeant, a no-nonsense man named Greg, called him into his office. "Sit down," Greg said, his tone serious. The officer sat, his heart pounding, but he still couldn't figure out why. "You know about the incident with the girl, right?" Greg asked. "Yeah, I dealt with it. What's the problem?" Officer Williams replied, still not understanding why this was an issue. Problem. You didn't just shave her head for no reason, did you? Greg's voice was stern, and the officer felt a knot in his stomach. Of course not. She was acting out. I was just making sure she learned her lesson, Williams explained, shrugging it off. She was causing a scene. Greg looked at him, his expression hardening. You don't understand, do you? That girl's family is well known. Her father is a very influential man. You've made a huge mistake. The officer froze. He had no idea who Maria's father was. It was just a random encounter, wasn't it? But now, as the realization began to sink in, he understood the gravity of his actions. I didn't know. Officer Williams stammered. He had no idea who he had crossed. Greg stood up, his anger rising. I don't care if you didn't know. You should have known better. You've made a mess, and it's going to be a lot harder to clean up than you think. Officer Williams sat back in his chair, suddenly feeling very small. The calm confidence he had felt earlier evaporated. This wasn't just about a mistake anymore. This was a big mistake, one that could change everything. The news of his actions had already spread far beyond the local community. It wasn't just a few angry voices now. It was a full-blown public outcry. And Maria's father wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. Officer Williams had no idea just how much trouble he was in. As the days passed, Maria's mother, Clara, worked tirelessly to get justice for her daughter. She reached out to her lawyer, spoke with community leaders, and even contacted the media to bring attention to the injustice that had been done to Maria. Clara was determined to make sure the officer's actions didn't go unnoticed. But it wasn't just for the public support. Clara had something much stronger driving her. Maria's father, Greg, was a man of influence, but he had always tried to keep his family's life out of the spotlight. He was a successful businessman who used his resources to help those in need, but he wasn't someone who often made a fuss. Greg was the kind of man who believed in quietly doing good without expecting anything in return. However, now that his daughter had been treated so unfairly, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this go. Greg had always taught his children to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. He had taught them about the power of kindness and strength, but he had also taught them the importance of standing up for their dignity, especially when they had been wronged. He had worked hard to build a life for his family, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially a police officer, take away their peace. The news of what had happened to Maria reached Greg's ears a few hours after he had finished a long day of meetings. He had been in the middle of discussing a new business deal, but as soon as he heard the details, he knew he had to leave. His daughter's pain hit him like a wave, and he could not stay at his office any longer. He immediately left work and headed home, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. When he arrived, Clara was already waiting for him. She was in the living room, on the phone with their lawyer, but the moment Greg entered, she hung up and rushed to him. "How is she?" Greg asked, his voice filled with concern. "She's been strong, but she's hurting, Greg," Clara replied, her eyes red from the long night of stress. Greg nodded. "I can't believe this happened. No one, especially a child, should be treated this way." Clara took a deep breath. "We need to make sure this officer doesn't get away with what he did. He humiliated her, Greg. He has to be held accountable." Greg's eyes narrowed. "I'll make sure he pays for this. I don't care what it takes." He wasn't angry for himself. He was angry because his daughter had been hurt. He was angry because Maria had been disrespected and made to feel small. He wasn't the kind of man who liked to cause trouble, but this was different. Maria was his daughter, and no one was going to treat her like this. Greg spent the night making calls. He contacted the mayor, influential members of the community, and even the head of the local police department. He explained what had happened and how he intended to take action. Greg was not the kind of person who used his power for personal gain, but when it came to his family, he would not back down. Maria had always looked up to her father, But now, seeing him take charge and fight for her, she realized just how much he loved her. She wasn't alone in this. She had a father who would do whatever it took to make things right. The next morning, Greg met with his lawyer, Clara, and a team of advisors to discuss their next steps. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew that going up against the system would take time, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. He had worked hard to create a life for his family, and he would do everything in his power to protect them. Maria's journey for justice was just beginning, and with her father by her side, she knew she wasn't going to back down either. As Greg and Clara worked together to find a solution to Maria's situation, Officer Williams continued his daily routine, blissfully unaware of the full extent of his actions. To him, it was just another case of discipline, another day at work. But the storm that was quietly building around him would soon become impossible to ignore. At the police station, whispers had already begun. His colleagues, who had once greeted him with friendly nods, now gave him uneasy glances. It wasn't just the local community talking about what had happened. It was everywhere. People were sharing stories on social media, demanding justice for Maria. News outlets began to pick up the story. But it wasn't just the media coverage that was starting to unsettle Officer Williams. It was the growing realization that someone very powerful was paying attention to what he had done. Officer Williams had never imagined that the girl he had humiliated was connected to a family of great influence. He had seen Maria as just another teenager, someone to put in her place. What he didn't know was that her father, Greg, was a respected businessman, philanthropist, and someone who had a long history of standing up for his community. And now, the weight of that realization was slowly settling on Officer Williams' shoulders. The more he thought about the situation, the more uneasy he felt. He tried to shake off the worry, telling himself that everything would blow over. But deep down, he could feel that this was different. He didn't realize it at the time, but the small, unthinking action he had taken had consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. The pressure continued to mount, and Officer Williams began to question his own actions. How had he been so careless? Why had he treated Maria the way he had? He tried to convince himself that it was a simple mistake, that he had been trying to teach her a lesson. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't just about disciplining the teenager. It was about something deeper, something rooted in the way he had treated her, and why he had felt entitled to act that way. Officer Williams' past began to surface, and it was clear that this wasn't the first time he had crossed a line. His colleagues, who had always kept their distance, now began to share stories about his previous conduct. It turned out that Officer Williams had a reputation in the department for being harsh, for taking matters into his own hands when it came to situations he didn't fully understand. People had always turned a blind eye, perhaps because of his rank, or because he was so good at pretending to follow the rules. But now, those who had stayed quiet before were speaking up, and the truth was beginning to come to light. His past actions were not just mistakes. They were part of a larger pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long. The officer's arrogance, his sense of superiority, had led him to believe that he could act however he wanted. But he was about to learn the hard way that his actions had consequences, and not just for him, but for everyone involved. The investigation into the incident was underway. Greg's influence was undeniable, and soon, the officers who had once overlooked Williams' behavior were beginning to reconsider their silence. More people came forward with stories, and it became clear that this time, the officer's past would not be ignored. Maria's family wasn't just fighting for justice. They were fighting against a system that had allowed someone like Officer Williams to feel untouchable. As the truth came out, Maria's bravery in sharing her story became even more powerful. It wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about the bigger picture of accountability, change, and standing up to injustice. The weight of his mistake began to hit Officer Williams like a ton of bricks. At first, he had shrugged off the growing tension surrounding the incident with Maria. He was sure the whole situation would blow over, just like so many others before it. But now, as the days passed, he could feel the pressure building. The quiet whispers at the station, the disapproving glances from his colleagues. It was clear that things were not going the way he had hoped. One afternoon, as Officer Williams was sitting at his desk, he overheard a conversation between two officers. The topic of Maria came up again, and he couldn't help but listen in. "She's the daughter of Greg Allen." "Right. One of the masked. The guy who runs all those charities and businesses around here." The mention of Greg Allen made Officer Williams pause. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Greg Allen was one of the most influential men in the city. He had worked his way up from nothing, becoming a well-respected businessman and philanthropist. His name was associated with countless charitable causes, and his generosity had made a huge impact in the community. "Yeah, that's the one," the other officer replied. "I heard he's been working with the mayor on some big projects. I can't believe Williams did what he did to her. That family is untouchable." "Untouchable," the first officer echoed. "You don't know the half of it. That man is a powerhouse. He's got connections everywhere. If he gets involved, Williams is going to be in serious trouble." The conversation made Officer Williams' stomach drop. His hands started to tremble as he processed what he had just learned. Maria wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of a man who had the power to change everything. A man who could destroy his career with a single phone call. Suddenly, Officer Williams felt a deep sense of regret. How could he have been so careless? How could he have thought that treating Maria so badly wouldn't have consequences? His actions, which he had thought of as nothing more than a way to punish a disrespectful girl, now seemed like a huge mistake. The weight of the realization was overwhelming. He had crossed a line, and now it seemed like there was no way back. Maria's father wasn't just any man. He was someone with the means to hold him accountable for what he had done. Officer Williams' career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was at risk. As the realization sank in, Officer Williams couldn't help but feel the fear creeping in. He had been so focused on asserting his authority that he hadn't thought about the bigger picture. Now he had to face the consequences of his actions, and they were coming fast. He spent the next few hours in a daze, his mind racing. What could he do now? Was there any way to fix this? Would Greg Allen forgive him, or was it too late? He couldn't escape the reality of what he had done. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, the truth was clear. He had made a grave mistake, and now it was going to cost him everything. In the following days, the investigation into Officer Williams' actions grew more intense. Maria's family wasn't backing down, and neither were the people who had rallied behind her. As the news spread, the public's support for Maria grew, and more people began to speak out. The pressure on Officer Williams continued to mount, and soon he found himself facing an undeniable truth. The mistake he had made was far bigger than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, Officer Williams found himself trapped in a whirlwind of regret. The situation that he had thought would blow over had spiraled out of control. The public pressure continued to grow, and now his every move was under intense scrutiny. The phone calls, the media attention, and the protests outside the police station made it clear he was not going to escape the consequences of his actions. Greg Allen, Maria's father, had never been a man to rush into anything without careful thought. He had always believed in taking the right steps, in finding the best way to handle things without letting his emotions take over. But this time, his daughter's pain had made him act swiftly. He wasn't going to let Officer Williams go unpunished. It wasn't just about the hair. It was about the principle, about how one person in power could hurt another without any reason. Greg had made his feelings known to the police department and to the city officials. He had spoken to the mayor, reached out to people in power, and demanded justice for his daughter. He wasn't asking for much, just for Officer Williams to be held accountable for his actions. The investigation was underway, but it was clear that things weren't looking good for the officer. His past actions had come under review, and more people began to speak out about the way he had treated others in the past. The more they learned, the clearer it became that Officer Williams had been careless with his authority, using his position to bully those he felt he could control. It wasn't just Greg who was angry. It was the whole community. People rallied together, supporting Maria and her family. They were shocked by the officer's actions, and many were willing to stand up and make sure that justice was served. Maria's story had sparked something powerful in the hearts of many, and the voices of those who wanted change grew louder with each passing day. The department couldn't ignore the pressure any longer. Officer Williams was called in for a meeting with his superiors. As he sat in the cold, sterile room, waiting for them to arrive, he couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. He had never imagined that his one rash decision would lead to the collapse of everything he had worked for. He had always believed that his position was safe, that he was above the consequences of his actions. But now he knew better. When the department officials walked in, they didn't mince words. They told Officer Williams that an internal review had been completed, and it was clear that he had violated the department's code of conduct. His actions had been inappropriate, and they could not be overlooked. The punishment, they told him, was severe. He was suspended without pay while the investigation continued, and as the news spread, the public backlash grew even stronger. People were outraged, demanding that Officer Williams be removed from the force entirely. His reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and his career was effectively over. In the weeks that followed, Officer Williams learned that Maria's family wasn't just fighting for her. It was about standing up for what was right. Greg Allen's influence had shaken the police department, but it wasn't just his power that had made a difference. It was the unity of the community, the support that Maria had received, that had truly turned the tide. As the investigation continued, Officer Williams realized that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The public had spoken, and the system had been forced to listen. What had started as a small mistake had grown into something much larger, and now it was clear that justice would be served. Maria, with her father and the support of her community, had stood tall. She had faced her pain and turned it into strength. She had shown the world what it meant to stand up for yourself, no matter the obstacles in your way. And for Officer Williams, it was too late to undo the damage he had done. The day Maria had been waiting for finally arrived. Officer Williams, now suspended and under investigation, was facing the consequences of his actions. His career was on the line, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truth was out, and the support for Maria and her family had become unstoppable. Maria had come a long way since that terrible day when her hair had been shaved without reason. In the beginning, she had felt small, humiliated, and uncertain of how to move forward. But now, with each passing day, her strength had grown. She no longer saw herself as a victim of injustice. She had become a symbol of resilience, a young girl who stood up for herself, even when the world seemed to be against her. Maria's parents had done everything in their power to support her, but it wasn't just them. The community, the people who had seen the injustice and had refused to stay silent, had played an important role in helping her heal. They had rallied behind her, their voices growing louder and louder as the story spread. Maria's story had sparked a conversation about the treatment of people in power, about accountability, and about the importance of standing up for what is right. As the public outcry grew, the department was forced to act. The investigation into Officer Williams was thorough, and soon it became clear that his actions were not just a mistake. They were a pattern of abuse that had been ignored for far too long. His career was officially over, and he was dismissed from the force. It wasn't just the public who had demanded justice. It was the people who had supported Maria, people who believed in fairness and equality. Greg Allen, Maria's father, had never been one to seek revenge. He wasn't looking to destroy anyone's life, but he knew that accountability was important. He wanted the message to be clear. No one should ever be treated the way Maria had been treated. He had fought for her, not because of his position or influence, but because it was the right thing to do. In the end, he was proud of his daughter for the courage she had shown. Maria stood by her father's side as he addressed the media. But this time, it wasn't about the officer or the injustice. It was about the future. It was about creating a world where people were treated with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. It was about inspiring others to speak out when they saw something wrong and to stand tall in the face of adversity. Maria took the stage, her shaved head now a symbol of strength, not weakness. She smiled as she addressed the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't just my story. This is a story for all of us," she said. "We are all capable of standing up for what is right. We are all capable of making a difference, no matter how small we may feel. I didn't let this experience define me, and neither should you." Her words resonated with the crowd, and the applause that followed was not just for Maria. It was for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever felt small. It was a reminder that people have the power to change things, to make a difference, and to fight for justice. Maria had taken something painful and turned it into something powerful. She had shown the world that even in the face of adversity, there was hope, strength, and the possibility of change. For Officer Williams, the lesson came too late. His actions had cost him everything: his job, his reputation, and his freedom. But for Maria, the experience had shown her the strength she didn't know she had. And in the end, she had the last word, not with anger, but with grace, courage, and a message of hope.